Today, we become legends.
The progress made on Smite 2 since the launch of 24/7 Alpha has been nothing short of impressive. The game went from an almost unplayable experience without much to differentiate it from Smite 1 to a much more complete experience with some truly unique elements that set it apart from its predecessor. However, there are absolutely still some issues the game is facing that need to be resolved before a full release. To be clear, I do think the game will be mostly ready for the free-to-play beta release coming in a few weeks' time. It's not perfect, but a ton of progress has been made, and the January patch itself adds so much new and ported content that for a beta release will suffice in my opinion. But as I said, there are still some issues that need to be addressed, and that's what this video will be about. If you watch my channel frequently, you know I don't make these types of videos just to shit on the game, nor do I want the game to fail. Quite the opposite, actually. I think providing constructive criticism will help the game become better over time. Much of the change we've seen over the last 6 months has been off the back of feedback from pros, content creators, and of course regular players of Smite 2. But with that said, let's jump in with my first major issue that needs to be addressed. These issues aren't going to be in order of importance, but it just so happens that this first one is the most important in my eyes, that being matchmaking. There's a variety of factors that go into why matchmaking is so damn awful in Smite 2 at the moment, but before we get into those, let's talk briefly about why I think matchmaking is the single most important issue facing the game right now. Smite is and always has been a competitive game, at least on some level. Are there more competitive games out there? Sure. Does every single player take it very seriously and care about the competitive side of things? No. But there will always be an underlying competitiveness to a game like Smite, and while its skill ceiling might not be as high as something like CS2 or League or Dota, there is still an absolutely enormous difference between a bad player, a decent player, a good player, and an excellent player. So much so that putting even a decent player against a good player is going to result in some terrible outcomes. The games are long and you're heavily punished for leaving them early, rightfully so by the way, but this is just further reinforcing the idea that good matchmaking is critical to all players having fun in Smite. Whether you're a hyper-competitive no-lifer that grinds 15 ranked games every day and consistently hits Masters, or a 45-year-old father of 2 that just hops on for a few games of Arena on the weekend, bad matchmaking ruins the experience for literally everyone. The casual and bad players don't want to be put against or with the Giga Sweats that play the game like a job, and the Giga Sweats don't want to be put against or with little Timmy who can barely move his character and misses his kit every team fight. Obviously, I'm going to extremes here to make a point, and the reality is that the skill levels are a bell curve, and the closer you are to the middle, the more people of equal skill to you there will be, but you get the idea. So why is Smite 2's matchmaking so bad right now? Well, I think it comes down to 3 core reasons: player base size, the hard reset, and broken algorithms, in that order of importance. Of course, player base size is the biggest issue here, but it is unfortunately the one that high-res have least direct control over. Matchmaking quality increases exponentially the more players you have, and we see this clearly with Smite 1 versus Smite 2 at the moment. Smite 2 pulls around 2k players while Smite 1 pulls around 5k, yet the matchmaking feels more than 2.5 times better because the more players you have to pull from, the more likely you'll find the perfect match at an exponential rate. That's why you can find pretty good matches when queuing at peak times around 6 to 10 PM, but if you queue at 3 AM, the matchmaking completely tanks to the point where it feels almost random. There's only around 3 times more people queuing at peak times versus at 3 AM, but that makes an outsized difference on the overall match quality. As I said earlier, unfortunately, this is the factor the devs have the least control over, and all they can really do is keep making the game better and hope that it attracts more players. Though I definitely think the free-to-play launch will help a ton with this. Smite 1's matchmaking has definitely taken a hit since the player base dropped off after Smite 2's announcement, but the matchmaking quality is still infinitely better than Smite 2, so even if the free-to-play launch doesn't bring Smite 2 up to Smite 1's previous numbers, which I honestly kind of doubt it will, if we can just get to around the numbers Smite 1 is currently pulling, it will make an enormous difference to match quality. Player base size is the most important factor, but it's not the only one, and I think a complete fresh start on MMR has also had a big impact on match quality for Smite 2. We've seen it before in Smite 1 where a complete ranked hard reset has caused the first few weeks or even months of rank to feel way more random than it would with a soft reset. And there's a reason casuals often feel like they have better matchmaking than ranked does. Part of that is player base size again, since around 3 to 4 times more people play casuals than play ranked in Smite 1, but it's also a factor that casual MMR has basically never been hard reset in Smite 1, so the system has years of data to look at and a very good idea of where you should be. The more games you've played, the more likely you are where you should be, and the more likely the system can find an accurate match for your skill level. But right after a hard reset, the system has literally literally zero idea where anyone should be. When the alpha first launched for Smite 2, the system genuinely thought Nika, Adapting, and all the other pros were at the same skill level as someone who's never even played Smite 1 and just picked up the game. That's obviously a problem, and I think the system still hasn't gotten enough data under its belt to accurately place people where they should be. Luckily, this one should just get better over time, at least for casuals, and I don't think the team are planning a hard MMR reset for casuals, only for ranked in the open beta patch. So in theory, all that previous alpha data will help separate some of the more experienced players from the new players coming in for the beta. This is a tough issue to solve as it is a completely new game, but I would argue that it's similar enough to where you could allow people with connected Smite 1 accounts to either transfer their MMR directly or at least allow them to start a bit elevated, equivalent to a soft reset, just to get those more experienced players out of the lower levels much more quickly, because an experienced Smite 1 veteran playing against someone who never played Smite 1 is going to be an awful experience for all involved. The third factor to the awful matchmaking in Smite 2 right now is probably the least influential, but still important, and that's the actual matchmaking algorithms themselves. The reason I say it's the least important is not because it doesn't matter, but because the other two factors actively make this one harder. The best algorithms in the world aren't going to be able to create a balanced match if the only people queuing at the time are 5 pro players and 5 Timmies. They also won't be able to create a balanced match if the only people queuing at that time were just hard reset to the exact same MMR regardless of how skilled they actually are. But even with those other factors making it harder, I do still think the team could do better with how they're making matches in Smite 2 right now. It was definitely worse in the beginning before they added systems like hard capping MMR ranges and role queue, but there's got to be more they could do to improve the current situation. Role-based MMR would certainly help, for example, as I'm sure literally everyone watching will admit that their best role is probably at least one rank higher than their worst role. So using the same number regardless of role leads to weird outliers where a game can seem balanced, but one team has 3 people in an off role and the other team are all in their main roles, so they stomp, despite having minimal MMR differences overall. Related to role-based MMR, I also think a system that should try and match opposing roles rather than trying to make team MMR averages match can lead to a better outcome. If the system sees 2 teams with an average of 3000 MMR, it thinks that's a perfectly balanced game. But if one team has all 3000 players and the other team has one 7000 player and 4 2000 players, it's not really a balanced match. Could the 7k player make up the difference and carry this one? Maybe, but even if that's the case, it still feels like an imbalanced match because the 4 2k players are frustrated because they get stomped by opponents that are clearly way better than them, and the 7k player is frustrated because he has to carry a bunch of shitters and basically 1v5. Even the team of 3k players probably aren't having a lot of fun there either because they feel cheated out of a win. They probably all won their lanes against the 2k players and were clearly better in 4 out of 5 roles, but then this Giga Sweat Grandmaster that got thrown into the game to even out the team averages just 1v5 them once team fights rolled around. So despite the team averages saying to the matchmaking system that this was a perfectly balanced game, literally none of the players involved had any fun. Again, adding more rules and regulations to a matchmaking process means less games are made, which results in very long queue times, especially at the level of players that currently play Smite 2, so there is a balance to be found there. I'm sure most players would rather have an imbalanced game sometimes than wait in hour-long queues just to get one perfectly balanced match. But still, I think more could be done with the matchmaking algorithm side of things to improve the player experience at the moment. Alright, as I said, matchmaking is the most important issue facing the game right now by far in my opinion, but I won't be spending as long discussing these next few, but they're still definitely worth talking about, starting with the out-of-game experience. By this, I mean everything about the game that's not happening in match. Menu screens, progression systems, tutorials, events, cosmetics, all that kind of stuff. This is a clear area where Smite 1 is just light years better, and of course that is mostly due to Smite 1 having over a decade of development under its belt, while Smite 2 is less than a year old at this point. But it is definitely something to look at going forward now that, in my opinion at least, the core game in terms of just playing a match feels really good, matchmaking aside of course. Some work has been done on this already with better god pages, ascension passes, some level up rewards coming soon with the free god tokens and stuff like that, even some basic tutorial features, but there's still a lot more work to be done, and I think this kind of stuff matters a lot more than people give it credit for, especially as we approach the full release of the game. I mean seriously, do we still not have a way to view items without going into practice mode? I don't even mean a full god builder necessarily, though that is of course the end goal. Just a rudimentary item page similar to the god page we have would help out a ton. I shouldn't have to go to outside resources and websites or launch into practice mode just to look at what an item does. This kind of stuff really makes the game look like an alpha and not a polished product, which I guess is fine during an alpha, but we're already going into beta very soon and that kind of stuff needs to be there for full release. Alright, next up is a somewhat related issue, and that's the lack of content, which is a much much harder one to solve, and honestly, I'm only mentioning it here because it simply is still an issue. I do think the team have been making amazing progress in getting more content into the game recently, and the open beta launch patch is coming with tons of new stuff to try. Like 2 new game modes, 5 new gods, the aspect system, new items, and more. So overall, I don't really have too much to say about the lack of content other than it exists and is being worked on as fast as possible by the devs. It's just the unfortunate reality that it's a brand new game and it simply will have less total content than Smite 1 for quite a long time. Though I do think that can be alleviated by a quality over quantity approach. Aspects being a good example of this. I think that system alone adds so much more depth and replayability to the game than Smite 1 will ever have. 50 gods with 50 aspects isn't quite as good as 100 gods, but it's far better than 50 gods without the aspect system. On the cosmetic side of things, Ascension passes are a great addition that makes it way more fun to grind worshippers on a variety of gods. It will be at least a couple of years until Smite 2 has more total content than Smite 1, but that's just the reality of making a new game and stacking it up against one that's been live for over a decade. I think the quality of content being offered in Smite 2 is making up for some of that though. And finally, let's talk a bit about bugs, jank, and glitchiness in Smite 2, as I do think this is a fairly big issue with the game, especially as we approach beta and full release. It's a little more acceptable in the early alpha stages, and I think it's been especially bad lately because the team has been pushing out new gods and updates as fast as possible to solve the content issues, which has resulted in very poor QA testing that lets through more bugs than is acceptable even for an alpha. Of course, there's a fine line to walk here, then there will always be an occasional bug. I'd rather get a patch every 2 weeks with a few bugs than a patch with the same amount of content every 4 weeks but with minimal bugs. But yeah, as we approach the beta and full release of the game, something does need to be done about the bugginess. I think we all bought into the idea of that a fresh codebase and a new engine will result in less bugs than Smite 1, but there's actually way more game-breaking bugs in Smite 2 right now than there has ever been in Smite 1. Again, this is likely due to the team pushing out content as fast as physically possible without properly bug testing it, and I think as the game gets more complete, more time can be taken to ensure the stability of patches, as there's less urgency to get core content like game modes and gods into the game as soon as possible. But that's 4 major issues that still persist within Smite 2. A lot of progress has been made, and this list would be a lot larger if I'd made it 6 months ago. But these are a few things that do still persist and still need to be addressed for the full release of the game. What do you think though? Do you agree that all of these are major issues, and are there others you would class as a major issue that I didn't mention? Let me know down below, and I'll catch you guys for another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.